Hi, welcome back or welcome to my channel. If you're new, my name is Laura. Hi, hello, welcome. Today we are going to do a comparison between a palette my friend Haley gifted me and a palette that I bought when it was on sale. So I have created this eye look here using these palettes, one palette on one eye, one palette on the other eye. I want you guys to guess first which palette you think is on what side. And I'm very excited to go through these. I'm also gonna do some shade swatching comparisons and just kind of talk about the similarities and differences in this palette. Also, Kaylee Wesley asked if I would compare some of the shades in my Subculture palette to these two. So you can see if you have these, do you really need these? Is one better than the other quality wise? Are they on par with each other? That kind of thing. So before we get into the video, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. I do appreciate it and it does help me out. And yeah, let's just get into talking about these palettes. This is not a tutorial video, so I just want to make sure you know. But I do want to let you know for the eye look, I used the same brushes and then I cleaned them off in between. I just wiped them down with just a washcloth. That way the colors weren't cross-contaminating each other. So the palettes look the exact same. So that is the Safari palette there, and then the Sea Color palette there. So, oh gosh, exactly the same setup and layout. This palette is hard to hold for me. So there are some definite similarities between the Subculture. I'm going to just kind of talk about the shades in this palette row by row, and we will, that's how we're just going to talk about it. So swatches of Safari are going to be on top, and then on the bottom are going to be swatches of the Sea Color. I have clips of everything being swatched, and just in between, I got this from the hospital. It's a no rinse cleanser, and that's how I cleaned my arms off and then wiped it down with a washcloth. I want to show you the palettes in their current state after swatching everything. That way you can see disruption in the pan and everything like that, because I think that's important to note as well. The Natasha Denona one does not look really disrupted at all in the pan. You can tell where some I put color, when I was just swirling around in it, you can tell where I might have gotten some shades on the side. That is how that guy looks. Then my Sea Color or Color palette, this is how this guy is looking. You can see a lot more powder just kind of floating around, especially in this shade here. This one in particular actually did have a nice chunk of shadow come off onto my arm that I was able to blend it in, but you can definitely see more of the disruption. Some of the side of the pan right here is just because the pans are smaller, so when you swirl your finger in it, it touches the side. It is what it is. So that is how that guy is looking. So you can definitely tell more disruption in the pans in this guy. And then honorable mention, I did swatch some shades from Subculture as well. So I mean, you can't tell. These in the blue, that's where you can really tell the most. So that is how that guy's looking. Okay, so we're gonna start with Malia here, and that is the counterpart right there. As you can see in the swatches, it almost looks more pink than the one in the Sea Color palette. This, oh gosh, this is a hard palette to hold because it doesn't go all the way back. So this shade definitely seems a little bit more pink in this than the counterpart. I would also say that Malia is a little bit lighter than the shade in the Sea Color palette. Now the blues, as you can tell, the shade Fata Morgana definitely is more teal based rather than this guy here. This definitely looks more true deep blue rather than a teal, and then the Subculture shade is way more impactful. This shade here and the Subculture one are drier formulas. They just, the Natasha Denona formula is very, very creamy and silky. This blue here and the ABH Subculture blue Axis are definitely more dry, and you can see the pickup and the kick up from just a finger swatch. That's from me running a finger into it and swatching. Whereas this one also has a lot of disruption from a finger swatch as well. I don't know if you're going to be able to tell on camera. So there is a lot of disruption in these drier formulas like these two rather than the Natasha Denona one, which is just very, very silky and smooth and creamy to the touch. Now, the next shade, Rhino, I swatched that one and compared it to the counterpart in the C-Color palette, this guy here, as well as Untamed from Subculture, that guy there. Again, there's some slight kick up in movement in the pan in this, as well as it doesn't look like much kick up in this guy. There's not much kick up in there, and then there's no kick up in the Natasha Denona shade. Rhino just seems a little more gray toned rather than green in the Natasha Denona and in the C-Color palette, whereas Untamed definitely is more pigmented. I think it's just the fact that these are like pigments rather than just like normal shadows. So this guy is way more pigmented. Even in the swatch, as you can see, there's definitely more going on in this. Now, Stone kind of surprised me because Stone almost seems a little more cool tone gray in the Natasha Denona palette. So Stone there, which makes sense. It's in the cooler toned row. I do like how this palette is like kind of segregated between like cool and like warmer tones, neutral tones like that. Now the one in the C-Color I think looks more true to gray. They're very, very similar, but there are slight differences. I can't verbalize what those differences are, but I hope you can tell in the swatches. Then moving on to Savanna, this shade almost seemed a little bit more chalky than the other shades. I think this shade in particular is probably the worst performing in this palette swatch wise as this goes. So I think the swatch just seems a little patchy. I did have to build it up a couple times. Now this was on a clean arm. There was no like wiping it down first. Like this row was the first one I swatched, so it was a clean arm. No product has been on my arm. I think the counterpart in the C-Color Savanna palette, I think this shade performs a lot nicer. I think it was just a little bit more buttery and smooth than the Natasha Denona one. And then the one that I paired with that is Destiny from Subculture. Again, more pigmented. I think this shade looks a little bit more similar to the one in the Safari palette by Natasha Denona. There is a slight difference in the depth of this shade in particular in the C-Color and Natasha Denona one. The Natasha Denona shade definitely seems a bit darker, whereas the C-Color one is definitely a hair lighter, which means the C-Color one you could build and blend a little bit easier. Moving on to row number 2, we start off with Aya, then Thorn, Desert Date, Shea, and Tribe this row here, as you can see, and then the counterparts in the C-Color palette, along with some, not many, there were 2 shades from Subculture palette that I swatched. So those, and you can see there's a lot of disturbance, especially in like this shade here, a lot of disturbance in that color in particular. So just starting with Aya, these shades look very, very similar. I was actually pretty surprised that the one in the C-Color palette looks a little bit lighter and it just appears more vanilla rather than like cream. So I toyed with the idea of pairing Dawn with that, but Dawn's just way too dark and it actually, I think, matches another shade in this palette a little bit better. Then we move down to Thorn, which is the second shade in the Natasha Denona palette. I think the shade in the Savanna palette is definitely lighter. Thorn is definitely more of that Hershey chocolate kind of brown. And then Fudge in the Subculture palette is more on par with how the shade in the Natasha Denona palette looks. It's definitely a richer, deeper brown rather than the Natasha Denona one. So again, I think that these colors are similar. I don't think you're going to see much on the eye. I am wearing this shade on the inner and outer portion of my eye today. The next shade is Desert Date. It's that very middle shade in the palette. I think the shades all look very, very similar. I don't think that there's much difference between them. The only standout difference is how much more crumbly this shade is versus the Natasha Denona one, which is pretty much unbothered with the swatching in this. The shade that is similar to it in this palette is New Wave here. It's just another orangey shade. I think that pairs really well and looks almost identical to the ones in the Natasha Denona. It is almost more warm toned, whereas Desert Date and the C Color Savanna palette are slightly, very slightly more cool toned. I do have Desert Date in the crease of my eye today. Then we move down to 𝙭𝙀𝙀, which is a deeper, more cool toned brown, which is weird because looking in the pan, it looks just like a brown. But I think that it is slightly more cool toned in both of these palettes. I think these shades are pretty much on par. I actually think I might prefer the brown in the Savanna palette. I think it just is a little bit more chocolatey, and it's a hair warmer than the one in the Natasha Denona palette. So I do actually prefer the brown in this guy a little bit more. Then we move to Tribe with its counterpart in the C Color palette. Another one that I feel like has some disruption. I don't know if you're going to be able to really tell. There's definitely some powder residually on top of the pan after a finger swatch. I think these colors are very similar. I think the one in this C Color palette, I do have that on the inner and outer portion as well of my eye. I think that it pulls almost more brick rather than just like an orangey red. So I think that this one pulls a little bit more brick red on the eye rather than the one in the Natasha Denona. I think that that pulls more orange red. I think I like the one in the Natasha Denona one a hair more. Then moving to the last row, which has Lotus, Amara, Masai, Voodoo, and Tamarind. I was actually very, very surprised how much deeper Lotus is in the Natasha Denona palette than its mauve counterpart in the C Color palette. Whereas this looks deeper. I think that that looks deeper personally in the C Color one than the Natasha Denona one. However, I definitely think Lotus picks up more impactfully, and it definitely has more depth to it. Then we move to Amara. Now, I think these shades are pretty similar in these two palettes. I don't think that there's much distinct differences in it. I did try to see the similarity between Roxy here in the Subculture palette. Roxy definitely is more orange coral and lighter. Then moving on to Masai, this beautiful like mulberry shade here. It's definitely more impactful. It has a lot more like boom punch to it rather than the shade in the C Color palette here, as well as I did pair it along with All Star here. None of the shades are very similar, honestly. Masai is very impactful. You get kind of what you're looking at as the color payoff, whereas this guy here is very light. Again, it's more sheer, so what you're seeing here is not really what you're going to get on the eye. And then the All Star shade is, I think, just a total different tone. It has more of like the brown base into it for that kind of shade. Then moving on to Voodoo here, this guy there, just a really deep like plummy tone, really deep, really beautiful. Obviously the counterpart here. And then I swatched also Rowdy from the ABH Subculture palette. Now I think that this is the second underperforming shade in the Natasha Denona palette, and maybe it's just because I don't fancy these kinds of colors. So I think that this shade definitely is more brown based rather than a plum based. And then you can see in the second shade that's closer to the left, the C Color one is definitely less light, definitely more brown, and then Rowdy from the Natasha Denona palette is definitely more impactful, definitely more dark, and it almost looks black on the eye or on the swatch. The next shade to the left is going to be Tamarind here, and I swatched that in with the similar shade in the C Color palette, as well as I did swatch it with Dawn here and Edge here, because Dawn is very much too light for this shade. It was definitely too dark to match Aya or Malia, but it's too light for Tamarind. So Edge, I think, is a little bit closer match. It has more of that yellow base to it. I think if you mix Dawn and Edge, you would get a very similar shade to Tamarind in the Natasha Denona palette. I think Tamarind is more impactful. I think it has more of that mustardy kind of base to it, whereas the Savanna counterpart, I think it's just a hair lighter, and it has a slight more like khaki base to it, like a little bit more brown base to it. And then Edge is very much that mustard kind of tone, and then Dawn is definitely too light. Now I just kind of want to talk about what I think is worth it and what I guess isn't. I think if you have the Subculture palette, I think that there's a lot of similarities in both palettes. I don't necessarily think you need both, but I think you get more variety in these 15 pan palettes rather than the Anastasia Beverly Hills one. Now, between these two, do I think one is better than the other? Yes and no. I think the feel of the shadows in the Natasha Denona one is definitely creamier. I think that these mattes are a little bit more blendable, a little bit more buildable, rather than the Sea Color one. That being said, I don't mind fallout. I don't mind a powdery eyeshadow because I do my eyes typically first. So I think you could get a very similar color payoff with this. There's some shades in here that just aren't up to snuff with this. In particular, Mosai here, it's just this one is way more impactful. Fata Morgana, also a shade that is definitely more impactful and a definite different tone than what is in this guy. However, I think that if this was the color that really tickled your fancy, I think this one performs much better in this palette than the Natasha Denona one, just based on a swatch alone. I think that this is a lovely palette. For the price point also, this is so affordable. I think you can get it on Amazon, and Sea Color does have a website where it's actually a couple dollars cheaper than buying it on Amazon. I think on their site alone it's $12, and on Amazon I believe it's like $14, $15. So if you're looking to save money, definitely this is a great way to go. If you're interested in this color story but not sure how much use you would get out of it, I think that this is going to be a way to go. This one is like 100% more expensive than this guy at full retail price. So this guy is like $12 to $15. This one full retail is $129. I did pick mine up on sale. I believe it still is on sale for half off on Natasha Denona's website. So if you know for sure you love this color story, if you have Subculture and you have been pining after like a Natasha Denona formula, I don't think her formula is worth the full-blown $129 price point. I just don't think any eyeshadow is really worth it in that opinion, as well as I don't think her shimmer formula is there for me. I just think her shimmers are very underwhelming. However, I think her matte formula is very, very buttery, very, very creamy, and very, very worth it, which is why this palette in particular is, I think, worth the $65 price point that I purchased this at. I don't think I would ever purchase a palette at the $129 price point. I can't. I wholeheartedly believe that this is worth every penny that you purchase this for. $12 to $15 for this kind of color story. I think that this is an astounding formula. I think the only shade that really feels chalky and rough is this Fata Morgana dupe shade. However, there's shades in here like this guy here that I think performs better, and depending on like the tones that you want, there are some differences in this color story. Not very much, and I don't think you can really tell a difference based on the eye look. I think that they're very, very similar. Natasha Denona is on this side over here, whereas the Sea Color palette is on this side over here, and I think they're very, very similar. I think you can get a very similar effect. I personally think I like the Natasha Denona side. That could just be a total placebo effect as well, just knowing how much this was and how much creamier and easier it was to blend. I will say some of this was almost too impactful right off the rip, whereas I would rather have something that was a little bit more blendable like this. So just depending on the price point you're looking for, the quality, how blendable you like your shadows, and how pigmented you like your shadows right off the rip, it really depends. I think this is a more blendable palette. I think it's a more buildable palette, and I think it's a creamier palette. This formula of Natasha Denona mattes, she does mattes right. I don't think she does shimmers right. I would not recommend a shimmer palette from her personally. This palette here, still very blendable, very impactful, a little less buildable, more impactful. And again, I think that for $12 to $15, less than 20 bucks, I think that this is a great value. Especially, I mean, the shades are going to be slightly less than half the amount of the Natasha Denona shades, but if you are not someone that wants to pan eyeshadow or go through 2.5 grams of eyeshadow, I think that this is an amazing value. So now I will say I am working on this shade in my Pan Those eyeshadow, so if you're curious to see how long it's going to take me to hit pan, I do recommend you watching that series. I'm not sure how quickly it'll be to hit pan in this versus a Natasha Denona shade I know is a very deep pan. So I do recommend maybe at the end of this month or in August, I might have this panned and you can see how many uses it takes me to get to that goal. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video wasn't super long. I do appreciate it if you did watch it all the way through. I know long videos aren't for some people. I don't mind a long video personally. I just can sit and watch YouTube all day rather than like TV. So again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Haley, so much for this palette. I truly appreciate it. I cannot wait to pan this thing. I can't wait for this palette to look like my subculture, in all honesty. So thank you so much, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye!